The night had a stillness to it that only a few people ever really notice, the kind of quiet that makes you feel as though something is just waiting beneath the surface, like the world is holding its breath. I want you to imagine that quiet with me because the story I'm about to share begins in moments like that, when life seems perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe, and yet underneath, a current of darkness is waiting to surge forward. Oh, we tell ourselves tragedy has a way of announcing itself, that danger comes with warnings, with signs, with a sense of dread, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it slips in unnoticed while people are just going about their lives. That's how it was on March 30th, 2022, in Pensacola, Florida. A gas station, a woman behind the counter, another woman walking the streets lost inside her own fractured mind, and the invisible threads of fate pulling them toward each other like iron to a magnet. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was far too late. Let me take you back to that morning. For Joey Helk, it began the same way it had so many mornings before. She was 42 years old, a single mother of two teenagers who depended on her for everything. Joey wasn't the type to complain about the burden, not out loud, but the truth was it wasn't easy. She carried a quiet exhaustion everywhere she went. The weight of bills, schedules, late nights, early mornings, all the unglamorous parts of raising kids and trying to keep a household afloat. And yet, if you had walked into the Circle K on New Warrington Road where she worked, you wouldn't have seen a woman beaten down. You would have seen her warm eyes, her tired but genuine smile, the way she greeted customers with a politeness that made them feel welcome, even in the blur of their own busy mornings. That morning, Joey had woken up before the sun, her routine practiced and efficient. She packed lunches for her kids, reminded her son about a dentist appointment later that day, and gave her daughter a few words of encouragement for a test she was nervous about. The life she had built wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, grounded, full of those small but vital details that form the foundation of family. By 7 a.m., she was behind the counter at Circle K, her hair pulled back, her uniform neat, ready to serve coffee to construction workers, parents dropping kids at school, delivery drivers grabbing a quick snack before another long shift. She wasn't thinking about danger. She wasn't thinking about tragedy. She was thinking about whether she had enough milk stocked, whether the register tape needed replacing, whether the day would stay calm enough for her to get out on time to be there when her kids came home. But not far from her, another life was unfolding in a very different way. Betty Jean Jackson was 32 years old, and her morning didn't begin with lunchboxes or reminders about dentist appointments. It began with voices. They were the first thing she heard when she opened her eyes, voices that had no mercy, no rest, voices that lived in her head like unwanted guests who had long overstayed their welcome. Betty had been diagnosed with schizophrenia back in 2007, but for years now, her treatment had been inconsistent at best. She drifted between shelters, park benches, and the occasional kindness of people who knew her family. One of those people was an older woman named Martha Wilkins, who sometimes let Betty sleep on her porch when nights got too cold or too dangerous. Betty's reality was not the same reality you or I live in. She inhabited a fractured world where commands came from something she called the director, a presence in her mind that told her who to trust, who to fear, and what to do. That morning, the director's voice was louder than usual. It told her there was a mission. It told her there were people she needed to target, two white people who had to be burnt up. To you or me, those words would sound like the ramblings of delusion, but to Betty, they carried the weight of orders from a higher power. She didn't question them. She didn't pause to reflect. She simply absorbed the command as though it were truth, as though the world demanded her compliance. This was the stage being set, the slow and terrifying build-up toward the act that would send shockwaves through countless lives. Around 11 that morning, Betty made her way to Martha's house. Martha was in her 70s, frail but still sharp, and when she opened the door to see Betty standing there with eyes darting wildly at things unseen, she felt that familiar tug of concern. Miss Martha," Betty said, her voice shaky but determined, "I need to borrow your gas can. I need to borrow your gas can. I got to put gas in my friend's generator." Martha hesitated. Something about the request felt off, but she didn't want to turn her away. She had known Betty's family for years. knew the pain and disorder that shadowed her, and sometimes compassion makes us ignore our instincts. So she handed Betty the red gas can with only a gentle warning. "You bring that right back, you hear?" And Betty promised she would. Meanwhile, Joey was still at the Circle K, ringing up purchases, stocking shelves, helping a steady flow of customers. One of them was Marcus Johnson, a construction worker on his break. He bought a coffee, joked about the unseasonable heat, and walked out with a smile. He would later remember Joey's easy laugh, the way it seemed so normal, so ordinary, just like any other day. And that's the cruelest part of tragedy. It doesn't announce itself. Nobody in that store knew that within the hour, life would be ripped apart in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Betty's first stop with the gas can wasn't Circle K. She walked to a different gas station first, clutching the empty container, asking strangers for money. Some avoided her, some looked away, a few offered excuses. But eventually she came across Chloe Thompson, a 22-year-old college student. Yes, Chloe was just filling up her car, probably thinking about her next class, her weekend plans, all the things young people think about. Betty approached her with a story that her car was just down the road out of gas. Could Chloe spare a few dollars? Chloe, being kind-hearted and not yet hardened by the world's lessons, felt a pang of sympathy. She agreed. "I'm going there anyway," she said. "I'll get it for you." This is where fate's cruelty revealed itself. Chloe would later replay this moment in her mind again and again, tormented by the idea that her kindness had unknowingly enabled something horrific. She didn't know. How could she know? To her, it was a small gesture, $5 worth of gas for a stranger in need. They drove to the Circle K together, and security cameras captured them walking inside. Chloe paid for the gas. Betty filled the can. Then Chloe drove away, believing she had done a good deed. Inside, Joey was helping Marcus check a lottery ticket. Betty lingered outside, the red can now heavy with fuel, the voices in her head building to a fever pitch. Now," the director said, "do it now." She's the one behind the counter. Betty's hands shook, but not from doubt, from anticipation. She reached into her pocket and touched the book of matches she had carried with her. At that very moment, David Chen, a taxi driver, pulled into the parking lot. He wasn't thinking about much beyond grabbing a cold drink before his next fare. He saw Betty standing outside, talking to herself, and something about the way her eyes flicked around unsettled him. He held the door open for an elderly man, glanced once more at Betty, and stepped inside. That small choice to notice her, to feel unease, would later haunt him because he would remember how close he had been to doing nothing at all. What happened next unfolded in a blur that somehow felt like slow motion to those who witnessed it. Betty walked back into the store, carrying the gas can with grim purpose. She didn't wander the aisles. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the counter where Joey was now alone. Joey looked up, confused at first, then alarmed as she saw Betty lift the can. She barely had time to open her mouth before the gasoline came pouring out, drenching her hair, her face, her shirt. The smell hit like a wave, sharp and suffocating. David Chen froze near the coolers, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. Joey gasped, stumbling back, and then Betty struck the match. The sound of ignition was deceptively small, just a soft swoon, but the effect was cataclysmic. In an instant, Joey was engulfed in flames, her body a torch, her scream a sound that would never leave the ears of those who heard it. The scream that tore from Joey's throat was not just a sound. It was a raw, primal eruption of terror and pain that seemed to split the air itself. People often say that when they hear someone scream in true agony, it never leaves them, that it etches itself into memory like fire onto wood. That was what happened in that store. David Chen dropped the soda he was holding, glass shattering on the floor, his heart pounding in his chest so hard he thought it might explode. For half a second he froze, his body caught between instinct and disbelief, his brain scrambling to decide whether this was real or some kind of nightmare he'd wandered into. But it was real, horribly, terribly real. Joey stumbled backward, her arms flailing, her face distorted in an expression of unimaginable horror. The flames clung to her like a living thing, feeding on her uniform, on her hair, on her very skin. She turned and ran toward the back of the store, a human torch, each movement trailing sparks and smoke. Betty didn't chase her. She stood there almost motionless, staring at what she had done, her eyes wide but strangely empty, as though she were watching a scene unfold on television rather than something she had caused. Marcus Johnson, the construction worker, was just stepping back into the store when he heard the scream. He froze for half a second in the doorway, then saw Joey running, flames devouring her body, and something in him snapped into action. He didn't think, he didn't hesitate. He sprinted past Betty, past the spreading gasoline slick on the floor, straight for the mop bucket filled with dirty gray water that sat by the counter. With a grunt, he grabbed it, sloshing water across the floor as he turned and hurled the entire contents onto Joey. The water hissed against the flames, steam exploding in a white cloud that stung his eyes and throat, but the fire retreated, leaving Joey smoking, her skin blistered, her body trembling. For one terrible moment, there was silence, broken only by Joey's ragged gasps and the crackle of smoldering fabric. Then another scream pierced the air, this one from Veronica, Joey's co-worker, who had been in the stockroom. She had heard the first scream and rushed out, only to see her friend in flames. In her panic, she tried to smother the fire with her bare hands, slapping at Joey's back, but the fire leaped onto her own polyester uniform. In seconds, Veronica was burning too. She shrieked, her voice high-pitched and frantic, clawing at her shirt as the heat consumed her. David Chen snapped out of his paralysis, pulling off his jacket and rushing toward Veronica. He threw it over her back, trying desperately to smother the flame. Marcus kicked over another bucket, this one filled with soapy water from mopping the floors earlier, and doused her with it. Between the jacket and the water, the fire finally died, leaving Veronica whimpering in pain, her arms mottled with angry red burns. The smell in the air was sickening: gasoline, smoke, burned fabric, and something far worse, something human. Customers who had been in the store ran screaming into the parking lot, some fumbling with their phones, others simply fleeing in blind terror. A man in a baseball cap stood frozen by the pumps outside, his mouth open, eyes wide, unable to move. A woman in a minivan leaned on her horn, shouting for someone to do something, though she herself stayed locked safely inside her car. David Chen fumbled for his phone with trembling hands, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He dialed 911, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Oh, we need both police and fire. Somebody just set a woman on fire at the Circle K on New Warrington. She's burned, oh my God, she's burned alive." His words tumbled over each other, frantic, disbelieving, but in the background the dispatcher could clearly hear Joey's groans, Veronica's sobs, and the chaotic shouts of terrified witnesses, and through all of it, Betty stood there. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't even tried to hide what she had done. She watched, her face slack, her body swaying slightly as if she were listening to someone no one else could hear. She mumbled under her breath, words that made no sense to those around her. "Miss, can you look out for some people? Some people. Please, some people, please." "I got a long way to go. I got to go to prison. Did I do it? I don't know. Did you see me? See, I'm real." Her words were half plea, half proclamation, floating into the smoke-filled air as the people around her stared in shock. Someone shouted, "Get her out of here." Marcus, his heart still hammering, turned toward Betty. But she didn't fight when he grabbed her arm. She didn't resist when he pulled her toward the door. She just went with him, her body moving as if she were sleepwalking, as if she had already surrendered to a reality only she could see. He shoved her outside where a crowd had gathered, eyes wide with horror. Betty looked around at them, blinking as though she had just woken from a dream. The sirens came then, a chorus of wails cutting through the chaos, growing louder, closer, until the parking lot was awash with flashing red and blue lights. Police cars skidded to a stop, officers leaping out with hands on their weapons, not sure what they were walking into. Fire trucks roared up, firefighters already pulling on their gear, dragging hoses, barking orders. Paramedics spilled out of ambulances, their eyes locking on Joey, who was barely conscious on the ground, her body charred and smoking, skin peeling in grotesque sheets. The scene was chaos, pure and apocalyptic. Firefighters sprinted inside to make sure the flames hadn't spread. Paramedics knelt beside Joey, working furiously to stabilize her. One of them, a young man with a shaved head, muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ," before barking at his partner to get more burn dressings. Another paramedic tended to Veronica, who was crying softly, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the angry blisters rising on her arms. Police officers moved quickly to contain Betty. Officer Linda Martinez, a 15-year veteran, was among the first to approach her. Betty didn't fight. She didn't argue. She just looked at Martinez with wide, unfocused eyes and said, "Is she like burned black? Is she like chocolate black? Is she like chocolate black?" Or did she not burn to a crust? The words sent a chill down Martinez's spine, but she stayed calm, slipping handcuffs over Betty's wrist. "Oh, you're coming with us," she said firmly, guiding her toward the patrol car. Betty muttered something else, fragments of sentences that made no sense. They just say, "I'm hearing voices. They say I'm seeing things. But when I get upset, nobody can calm me down." Inside the store, the fire was out, but the damage lingered in every charred surface, every blackened shelf, every lingering wisp of smoke. And outside, in the back of the ambulance, Joey clung to life, her breath shallow, her skin a patchwork of burns so severe that even seasoned paramedics struggled to look at her without wincing. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, her chances of survival uncertain. Veronica followed in another ambulance, her injuries less severe but her spirit shattered. The Circle K was roped off with yellow tape, the parking lot swarming with police, firefighters, news crews who had already caught wind of the horror. Customers who had been inside gave their statements, their hands still shaking, their voices trembling. David Chen sat on the curb with his head in his hands, replaying the moment over and over and over in his mind, the match flaring, the flames leaping, Joey's scream ripping through the air. He would never forget it. None of them would. But for Betty, reality was different. In the back of the patrol car, she sat quietly staring out the window as though the flashing lights and frantic activity outside had nothing to do with her. Every now and then she muttered under her breath, speaking to someone no one else could see. To her, this wasn't chaos. This wasn't tragedy. This was destiny, commanded by the director, carried out with a calm certainty that frightened everyone who heard her speak. And as the sun sank lower in the sky that evening, a community struggled to comprehend what had just happened. A hardworking mother, beloved by her children, was fighting for her life. A coworker bore burns that would scar her forever. Witnesses grappled with the trauma of what they had seen. And a woman, broken by years of untreated mental illness, sat in a police car, detached from the destruction she had caused, murmuring about people no one else could see. The courtroom had grown silent, the kind of silence that presses down on everyone like a heavy weight. And as the judge read out the sentence, the words seemed to echo far longer than they should have. Life in prison for Betty Neumer. For some, it felt like justice at last, a necessary conclusion after all the pain she had caused, but for others, especially those closest to Joey, nothing could ever feel like enough. No ruling could bring back the gentle soul who had been stolen so suddenly, so violently, so violently. People in the gallery shifted in their seats, some looking down, others letting tears fall openly, the weight of the moment too heavy to contain. Betty herself sat with an expression that flickered between resignation and denial, as though she couldn't quite decide whether to accept the finality of it or cling to the strange, fractured version of reality she had always carried inside her. She would never walk free again, and perhaps that was the only way the world could be sure she would never hurt anyone else. But for Joey's family, the pain didn't vanish with the sentence. They had lived with the memory of his last breath for too long. The image of him fighting for his life burned into their minds. His mother still woke in the middle of the night, hearing his laugh in her dreams, reaching out in the darkness only to feel the emptiness where her son should have been. His friends still gathered sometimes at the spot near the gas station where candles and flowers had once filled the night, speaking of him as though he were still there, telling stories and refusing to let his memory fade into silence. They wanted to believe the world could learn from his death, that people might finally start taking the warnings of untreated illness, of silent suffering more seriously. And yet, as the days turned into weeks and the trial slipped from headlines, there was always the fear that Joey's story would become just another tragedy swallowed up by time. Betty was moved into a cold concrete cell that seemed to reflect the emptiness of her own life. Other inmates kept their distance at first, whispers of what she had done passing along the rows of iron bars like ghostly voices. She carried herself with a strange mix of pride and confusion, as though part of her still couldn't see why the world had turned against her. At times she would sit alone, staring at the walls, muttering to herself, fragments of a mind that had never truly healed spilling out into the void. On some days she wept, on others she smiled in ways that unsettled even those hardened by years behind bars. Her story was one of destruction, and now she was left only with the consequences of her choices, condemned to live in the shadow of the life she had taken. Outside those prison walls, Joey's absence was felt everywhere. His childhood home remained a shrine of sorts, his belongings carefully kept as though he might walk through the door at any moment. His family found themselves caught between the unbearable weight of grief and the fragile necessity of moving forward, trying to honor his memory by living in ways that reflected the kindness he had always carried. His friends spoke of him often, and sometimes they laughed, remembering the little things, the way he used to smile when he was nervous, the quiet jokes he slipped in when no one else was paying attention. But beneath the laughter, there was always the wound that would never fully close, the truth that he had been taken far too soon. The town itself never quite forgot either. For years, people lowered their voices when they passed the old gas station at night, the flickering light over the pumps a constant reminder of that violent evening. It became part of the town's whispered history, one of those tragedies you couldn't talk about without feeling the chill of it. Parents used it as a warning for their children about the dangers of ignoring signs, about the darkness that can grow unnoticed until it bursts into the open. And in some quiet way, Joey's name became a symbol, not just of loss, but of a need for vigilance, for compassion, for the willingness to reach out to those whose minds might be slipping into dangerous places. The years went on, as they always do, but the shadow of the crime stretched far longer than anyone expected. Joey's family pushed for changes, for awareness campaigns about mental health, about recognizing the signs of someone losing their grip on reality. They spoke at schools, at community meetings, at any place where someone might listen, determined to turn their grief into something that could save others. And while not every ear was open, enough people heard to keep the message alive. In their darkest hours, that was the only comfort they had, the belief that Joey's death might prevent another, that his story could light a warning in places where silence had once ruled. For Betty, the years dragged in a blur of iron doors and locked routines. Time seemed to erode her, piece by piece, until even she couldn't remember what had driven her to that moment of violence. Her name faded from headlines, her trial forgotten by those not directly touched by it, until she became just another inmate, one more broken soul among many. Yet for those who had lived through it, her name still carried weight, still stirred the memory of fear and sorrow. In the end, she would die alone, far from the community she had once haunted, her story closing in a silence as heavy as the one that had filled the courtroom years before. But Joey's story didn't end there, not really, because every time someone told it, every time a mother warned her child, every time a teacher spoke about the importance of compassion, every time a friend remembered his laughter, Joey lived to end, if only for a moment. His story became less about the horror of his death and more about the reminder that every life, no matter how brief, carries meaning that cannot be erased. And so, while Betty's name faded into darkness, Joey's memory continued to glow quietly, kept alive by those who refused to let him disappear. Even now, as the years stretch on, the image of that night remains vivid for those who knew. The sound of footsteps, the rush of violence, the breath stolen too soon, it still haunts the edges of memory. But alongside that darkness, there is also light, the kind that comes from love, from remembrance, from the determination to honor a life taken unfairly. And in the end, that is what remains. Not the cruelty of one broken mind, but the enduring strength of a family and community who refuse to let tragedy have the final word. And maybe that is the lesson left behind, a reminder that life is fragile, that compassion matters, and that even in the darkest tragedies, memory can shine brighter than violence. Joey's story still speaks, even now warning us, teaching us, reminding us never to look away. And if you've stayed with me through this long, painful journey, I ask you to carry his memory forward too. Share his story so it is never forgotten. Keep the conversation alive so others might be spared the same fate. And if you want to walk with us through more stories like this, stories that dig deep into the truths we sometimes try to avoid, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because in remembering and speaking and refusing to let silence win, we keep the past alive. And maybe, just maybe, we change the future.